Hello, everyone. So for today, we're just going to do questions and I can start right away. So if anyone has a specific question that they wanted to go over, either from Cengage or from one of the practice midterms, or just kind of a generic question about a topic, feel free to either unmute yourself and ask or type it into the chat window.
I have a question. Can you go over number 13 from the practice midterm?
Yes, I definitely can. Is that the question asking about the graph with the social value and private value?
Yeah, so it's one with the subsidy and the tax. I just didn't know, like, I know why it's a subsidy, but I don't know why it's like one and not the other. So yeah, that's the one with the graph.
Okay, definitely. Okay, so let me see if I can share that too. Okay, so that is question 13. So it's asking, the graph shows the demand and supply for a good in a particular market. So if the government wanted to tax or subsidize this good to achieve the socially optimal level of output, it would what? And so the correct answer is A, introduce a subsidy of $16. And so the reason for that is basically you have the private cost, private value. So the private cost curve, that's going to be the effectively supply curve. And the private value curve is going to be the demand curve. So you can think of the point right here. Let me see if I can kind of. So that point right there as being the point where the normal equilibrium is going to be. So the normal equilibrium is going to be the intersection of 30 for price and 200 for quantity. And so what this tells you then by you seeing the social value is that you know that this is a positive externality because the demand curve is shifting up from what it normally would be. So because of that, you know that the price and quantity should be greater. But the weird thing with a social benefit or a positive externality is that the government wants to keep the price the same as the normal equilibrium, but just increase the quantity in the market. So basically to do that, what they're going to do is just come up from this equilibrium point to this equilibrium point. And then what you'll do to find the amount of the subsidy is just see this intersection point here and compare it with the intersection point here. And it should be pretty comparable to the intersection point. So I think this one is about at 42, I want to say. And so what you can say is basically, so by increasing the quantity sold, you're basically going to be moving up $12, but because the because this doesn't actually give you the full difference, so it's basically like introduce a subsidy of 16 or 12, you always want to try to get the most or the highest quantity consumed possible for a social good, which is why in this case it would be 16 and not 12, even though technically you can kind of see that the difference between these two is 12. So that's kind of why it would seem like it should be 12. But, and this is kind of the other piece. And so this difference here between these two is actually 16. And so that's how you're going to get the 16, is comparing this up and down, not this side to side. So I hope that was a very long way to answer that question. Let me know if that makes sense.
I was just like confused about like the scaling that they use, like on the like if on the like the real midterm, like how would I know that like that is how they scaled it? You know what I mean? Like
Yeah, so like let me make sure I understand your question. So basically, like for scaling, as far as the price scaling.
yeah.
Yeah, so it's hard on this one. So I know on the normal midterm, they're going to be much more specific with like these scaling lines.
Okay.
So it'll be much more explicit rather than like you having to go 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. It should be much more explicit and much more normal on the midterm.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
So yeah, that answers it. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Does anyone else have a question that they would like to go over from either the practice midterm or Cengage or kind of like a general topic? Yes, yeah. So the midterm's going to be open book. The big thing, and so I'll stress this again. So last time what happened, the department found there was like a very large kind of, they basically found evidence of like a lot of cheating on the last midterm. So for this midterm, we are all not allowing backtracking. So basically, when you move from one question to the next question, you cannot go back to the prior question. So just make sure that when you're taking the midterm, that's something that you're aware of. But yeah, it definitely is open book. So like, feel free to use any sort of resources from the course. They're not going to give more time. So it's going to be the exact same amount of time as last time, which I believe was 75 minutes. And there's definitely like, if there are any issues or anything, like you can feel free to email me. And I can always give like a couple more minutes. We're usually flexible within like 5 to 10 minutes, but we have a pretty hard deadline of like around 75 minutes just to make sure it's fair for all the students. Yes, so the practice midterm is pretty similar to the actual midterm. Obviously, the big thing is like the content. So like and let me share my screen again. So like, for example, the content on this is going to be similar. So like the questions about like graphs that are talking about the negative externalities and positive externalities will definitely be on the actual midterm. The big thing is like the question won't be exactly the same, and they'll have different numbers too. So like they're not going to be exact copies of it. Yeah, no worries. Does anyone else have any other questions that they wanted to go over about the midterm or homework or quizzes? Yes, yeah. So this graph is a positive externality. And the reason that you can tell that is because and let me see if I can get my little laser pointer to work. But basically what you can tell is you can tell that because there's the social value and the private value. So basically, whenever you see there is there are two kind of demand curves, that's how you know it's a positive externality. And if there were two supply curves, you know it's a negative externality, because negative externalities operate on the supply curve and positive externalities operate on the demand curve. And another way to talk about demand curves is to call them the private value, whereas the supply curve can also be called the private costs. Did that answer your question about the graph? Excellent. Yes, so I'm fairly certain there will be a curve. The curve totally depends though on what the average grade is. So like if the average grade for this is like a B minus or a high C plus, there won't be a curve. But if the grade is lower than that, then there definitely will be a curve. And so every time I've taught this class, there's always been a curve. Exactly. Yeah. So private cost with social cost is the negative externality. And then private value with social value is the positive externality. The Coase, there may be something about the Coase theorem. The big takeaway though from the Coase theorem that I would just kind of remember is on one of the lecture slides, let me see if I can bring it up. There's just like this very, very short description of what the Coase theorem is. So that's kind of all that I would really remember or pay attention to as far as like the Coase theorem. And let me see if I can find that specific slide. Yeah, so let me share my screen really quickly. So yeah, the big thing with the Coase theorem is like, I would try to just remember what it is. So it's basically just the idea that like private parties can bargain with one another. And it's kind of the idea behind it is that if individuals have like property rights or certain rights that are private, so like the individual owns them, then individuals can come to some sort of agreement. And so like, for example, in the example problem, the big thing here is like, so the first part is, just kind of generic, but this is the really important part. And this is what the Coase theorem is. So it's either that one person has a legal right to peace and quiet, or the other person has the right. And so in this case, because Kathy has the legal right, what's going to happen is that because John values playing music at 600, but Kathy values her quiet at 1,000, Kathy's going to pay John to stop playing music. And it's basically going to be anywhere between the $600 that John values playing music and the $1,000 that Kathy values quiet. So that's basically just the Coase theorem, is that the two parties can work out a solution to their problem without any sort of government involvement. Does that answer your question on the Coase theorem? Perfect. Does anyone else have any other questions that they wanted to go over?
Can you talk about question 23?
Yes. From the practice midterm?
Yes.
Okay. So Peter's the owner of a local bakery, and his store is located on the east side of his mid-sized town. He is considering including a few additional items on his regular menu with information on his costs. In the short run, Peter is able to sketch his short run cost curves. if we look at his graph, which curve would you expect to see intersect the minimum point of the average total cost curve? Okay, so when you are looking at graphs of the average total cost curve, what you want to see is that the marginal cost curve is going to intersect the lowest point of the average total cost curve. And it's basically, the reason for that is that when the marginal cost curve intersects the minimum of the average total cost curve, that is how you know the individual's costs are at their lowest. And I believe, let me just pull up chapter 13 and see if there's a graph in here. Yeah, so, and let me share this with everyone too. So this example right here is exactly what that question is asking about. So this intersection point between the marginal cost curve and the average total cost curve. And basically what that's saying is that when the marginal cost curve crosses the average total cost curve, so at this point right here, that's when you know that average total costs are at their lowest possible point. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions as far as anything that they wanted to go over?
Can you go over number 27? Because it's kind of like on the same chapter 13 topic.
Yes, definitely. Okay. So 27 is asking, consider that the government imposes a $1.50 per unit fee on all the pizzas produced at all pizza restaurants. So as a result, which cost curve shifts? Okay, and so the correct answer for that one is A, the average total cost and the marginal cost. Okay, so the thing with this one that you really want to pay attention to is that this is a government fee and it's a per unit fee. So the first thing that you know is because it is a per unit fee, it is not going to impact fixed costs. So anything that has fixed costs in it, you can eliminate right away. So you can eliminate in this case, the answer B and answer C, because answer B and C both have fixed costs. And so because of that, then you're only left with answer A or answer D. So answer A is basically saying, is it the average total cost? And so we know that the average total cost is the combination of the average variable cost and average fixed costs. And so because we know that this is a per unit fee, it is going to impact the variable costs. So we can say that that is going to be true. And then for the marginal cost, so the marginal cost is just basically the change in total cost and the change in quantity. And so we can also say, because we know the average total cost is going to change, we know that the marginal cost is going to change. So then in that case, we know that A is the correct answer.
Thank you. That was clear. Thank you.
Yeah. Did anyone else have any other questions on anything that they wanted to review for the midterm? Yeah, okay. So 21. Okay, so 21. So 21 is asking in Manhattan, 23rd Street between 3rd Avenue and 9th Avenue. And the correct answer is C. So it is a common resource when congested, but a public good when not congested. So this one, that's a really good question. And it's kind of weird because when you think of a street, you think of it as being a public good. But the key piece in this question is that it's saying when it's congested and when it's not congested. So when it's not congested, it's a public good because the street is not rival. So like if I drive my car on the street, you can also drive your car on the street and there's no impact to each other. But when it's congested, it is a common resource because it is rival in that case. Because if I choose to drive my car on the road and you also choose to drive your car on the road, we're both slowing down traffic. So we're both making the street much slower for everyone. So that's why it's dependent on congestion.
Can you talk about number 10?
Yes. Okay. Okay. So number 10 is asking about the graph and domestic market for calculators. So I'm assuming, okay. Yeah, so the graph should be the graph above, not the graph below. But so it's asking about the graph represents the domestic market for calculators in Canada, where the quantity is in thousands of calculators. So currently the world price of calculators is $7 and the government is considering whether to impose a $2 tariff or a $2 consumption tax in this market. So if the government imposes the consumption tax compared to imposing the tariff, consumers are what? And so the correct answer is B, no better off or worse, because the deadweight loss in the market is 4,000. So the first thing here that you want to notice is that so consumers are going to be impacted regardless of if it's a tariff or a consumption tax, because both items are going to negatively impact consumers. And producers are also going to be worse off as well. And it's weird in this one to think that way, but what you can think about is so you're comparing so you have the initial equilibrium right here. Let me see if I can get a different color. So you have the initial equilibrium point right here. And then the initial equilibrium quantity is right here. Okay. So the initial price is going to be $12. So going back to the question, so the world price is $7. So we know that so 5, 6, so the world price is right here. Okay. So if you're saying that imposing the tariff, consumers are no better off and producers are worse off, and the deadweight loss in the market is 4,000. Okay, so the way that you can then take a look at it is say, so if there is a $2 tariff versus a $2 consumption tax, what is going to be the difference? So the difference is going to be who is impacted by each of the taxes. So for the consumption tax, that's going to be basically a tax on consumers, whereas the tariff is a tax on foreign producers of the good. So it's not a tax on domestic producers, just on foreign producers. So that's an important piece of this too. The difference between the consumption tax, which is purely on the consumers, it's just raising the price that they pay, whereas a tariff is basically pushing foreign producers away from being able to sell in the market. And if we do that, this is the new line. So we can kind of see here that we have the deadweight loss triangles at this point and at this point. So we basically have, this is going to be deadweight loss right here, and then this is going to be the deadweight loss here. And this would be tariff revenue in the middle. And so then to find the two deadweight loss triangles, we would just use the 1/2 base times height formula. Did that answer your question for that one? I know that was kind of a long explanation.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Did anyone else have any other questions that they wanted to review for the midterm?
Would you be able to go over like the concept of economies of scale and diseconomies of scale?
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. So when we're talking about economies of scale and diseconomies of scale, the first thing you want to think about is, what are the firm's costs? Are they decreasing in the long run, or are they increasing? So the idea with diseconomies of scale is that the larger the firm gets, or the more production it produces, it becomes less efficient. And so let me share my screen so you all can see the graph that I'm looking at. Okay. So basically what you're talking about with diseconomies of scale is that the average total cost curve is rising. So you can think about diseconomies of scale as being at this point up. So this firm is experiencing diseconomies of scale from here and then all the way up, because average total cost is increasing as they produce more quantity. And you can think of the opposite, economies of scale, where the average total cost curve is falling. So from maybe this point all the way down to this point. So that's economies of scale. And then this middle point is constant returns to scale. So where average total costs don't either decrease or increase, they just stay the same as you produce more quantity. And then just to kind of talk about, like, I think a good way to think of firms is that, like, so when you are talking about economies of scale, one of the firms that I always think about is a firm like a power company or a company that provides like internet, because they have really, really high fixed costs up front, but then the more quantity they produce, their average total costs are decreasing, because once they run power lines or once they run cables under the ground, they don't really have any other costs. Their labor costs are really, really low compared to their fixed cost of actually installing it. So that's kind of a company that exhibits economies of scale, which I think is kind of helpful for thinking about economies of scale and why they work. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Does anyone else have any other questions for the midterm that they wanted to go over? I think maybe one area then, if no one has any questions, that I think is kind of important and students often overlook is the idea of opportunity costs. I know it seems really simple, like especially the first couple problems on the practice test, but I would really say like try to make sure you're able to solve those. And I would try to like maybe make up a few even just on your own. So like plug random numbers in and just make sure that you can work through kind of how those, how to find the opportunity costs on your own. Because that's kind of an important piece that you can definitely expect there to be some questions on the midterm.
To add on to that, can you show it how I would be able to like find like the price where like both countries would gain from with the trade, like with the opportunity cost?
Yeah. So let me take a look. Okay, so I'm going to do kind of go over one of the examples from chapter 3 and 9. And let me share my screen. So this is a pretty simple example, but the nice thing is like this example is basically going to be true for all kind of variations of the problem. So you first start out here with just very simple, a very simple table that shows you the production in the US and China for two different goods. So then we're just we fill in the opportunity costs or find the opportunity cost for the good, which is pretty straightforward and simple. So then the next piece though, is you need to determine which country is going to specialize in which good. So we can see that the US has a lower opportunity cost in clothing than China does. So the US is going to specialize in clothing. So let me get my pen. So basically what the US is going to do is the US is going to produce clothing and China is going to produce food. So the next piece is how do you determine the possible terms of trade, which is what you were getting at. So when you're thinking about terms of trade, the easiest way to think about it is that the terms of trade for each item have to be basically in between these two goods. So like for clothing, it has to be between 5/3 and 3. And the same is true for food. So it's going to have to be between 1/3 and 3/5. And so as long as the terms of trade between the country are between these two items, then both countries are going to benefit. In most problems that we give you on the midterm are going to be pretty clear. So it'll basically say, you know, between these two between these two numbers, the terms of trade will be maybe 2 for clothing and 2, maybe like 2/3 for food. So basically, as long as it is always between those two numbers, you don't have to worry. You don't have to worry about trying to like actually figure out what is the best item, because we're always going to give you a couple different choices to choose from. If that makes sense, I hope that kind of clarifies it a little bit.
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions on the items for the midterm? Yeah, so quotas, okay. So let's take a look at a quota. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay. So for quotas, the thing that's kind of weird and confusing about quotas is that they're not actually based on price, they're based on quantity. And so the big thing with quotas that you want to determine is, so let's say that you are given in this instance, the world price is at $20 and you want to reduce the number of imports to a certain amount. So let's say that you want to reduce the total number of imports by 30. So basically then what you do is you just see at which price the imports are reduced to 30. So in this case, it would be the 70 minus 40, which is 30. And if we're looking at like the impact of imports, what we can see is that the deadweight loss looks a little bit different. And the reason for that is because the price is not changing, it's the quantity that's changing. So the price here is basically staying at $20 up until you get to the amount or the point where it's going to shift over and intersect with the price of 30. In the price of 30 you get basically by taking a look at where the difference between the amount of imports and the amount of domestic production is going to get you the quantity that you want. And just kind of like as a final analysis on that, when you're looking at the kind of the impact on an import quota, the key thing here is like the deadweight loss is going to look different. So notice here the deadweight loss is E, F, H, and I. So it's E, F, H, and I. Whereas normally we have the two triangles. And the reason for that is because producer profit is still gained at this point. Because this is the amount of profit that foreign companies are getting by importing. So notice here it says foreign profit is the same. So foreign companies are not losing anything compared to a tariff, but you just find their profit differently. Does that make sense for the quota? Because I know quotas are, I always find them a little weird compared to tariffs. Yeah, the big thing with quotas, I think, is like if you're ever, if you're asked a question about quotas, the big thing is think of quotas as always being quantity, not price. So they're always going to be based on the quantity, not the price of the good, whereas tariffs are on the price of the good, which is how we normally think of things. And just one more thing on quotas, because I know they are kind of weird, is that most of the questions on the exam are usually not going to be asking you about kind of what the reduction is. They're basically going to try to get you to think about what is the price going to be if they want to reduce tariffs by X number of dollars, or reduce imports by X number of goods. So in this case, if they said that they only want 30 imports to still occur, you would basically just have to go to the graph and say, so the difference between 70 and 40 is 30, and then just go over to the price and say the price is going to be $30. So that's kind of a simplified version of quotas, if you kind of want to try to think about it that way too. Did anyone else have any other questions that they wanted to go over from any other practice problems or from Cengage?
Can you talk about the absolute advantage?
Yes, definitely. So let me share my screen again. Okay. So the difference between absolute and comparative advantage is really important, but I think is really kind of important to see. So let's say that we're looking for the absolute advantage in the production of artichokes. So it's basically just you are able to produce the most amount of the good. And so in this case, for artichokes, we can see that California, it has the absolute advantage in artichokes. Whereas for cattle, Nebraska has the absolute advantage in production. And so if we look at a different example, so let's take this example. So in this example, the US has the absolute advantage in the production of food and the absolute value or the absolute advantage in the production of clothing. So note that a country can have the absolute advantage in the production of both goods. It does not have to be true that one country has the absolute advantage in either good. Like in this case, one country can have the absolute advantage in both of the goods being produced. Did that answer your question on absolute advantage?
Yeah, and can you, like, I'm a little confused about question 2.
Question 2. Yes, on the midterm.
Yeah, midterm.
Okay. Okay. So question 2 is once again asking about trade and basically saying that you're assuming that Brazil and Chile can switch between producing beef and producing wheat at a constant rate. So the table above shows the pounds of beef or the bushels of wheat each country can produce in 1 hour. So Brazil has an absolute advantage in the production of what? Okay, so the correct answer for this one is D. And so we can see in bushels of wheat that Chile has the absolute advantage in the bushels of wheat production and the absolute advantage in the production of beef.
Oh, okay. I get it.
Yeah. Did anyone else have any other questions that they wanted to go over? And if not, I do have, because I know quotas are really weird. So I actually, in my class last semester, I actually did kind of an example in class, and we used this example and kind of reviewed this. So let me see if I can make it bigger. So the graphs look similar, but I think kind of the thing that this one has a little bit more description on is the quantity. So you can see here that this is domestic production. So between the zero price and the initial point of the intersection with the supply curve, that is all domestic production. And then this is imports. So these are the amount of imports into the country. Then you have this piece right here, which is effectively the domestic again. So because the quota is on these, this is going to be domestic production from this point to this point. So those are kind of two different ways to look at the graph. I'll put this in the chat as well, if anyone wants to take a look at it in a little bit more detail as well. Because I think it's kind of an interesting way to look at it. Yeah, and so it's kind of weird because this is a slightly different version of kind of what we were looking at before, but the concept and the idea is the same. So basically you have this like amount of imports and you have the domestic production, and then you have more domestic production, because basically the idea behind quotas is that there is a very specific amount of imports allowed into a country, and anything over that amount again becomes domestic until you have the intersection of the supply and demand curve. And in this case, the supply curve is a little bit shifted over because it is a quota, not a tariff. Did anyone else have any other questions that they wanted to go over on any of the stuff for the midterm? So I have not seen the final midterm yet, but last semester there was not a question on quotas on the midterm. That does not mean that there will not be one this time on the midterm, but I know last time there was not one. And I think this midterm they're trying to make a little easier than the last midterm, just because the last midterm had quite a few calculations. So I would assume that this midterm is going to be a little less math heavy than the last midterm. But I would still make sure that you have kind of all of the like algebraic, so like the algebra examples that I went over in the slides, I would still have those up when you're taking the midterm, just because if there is an algebra problem, the algebra examples that I do are really, really comprehensive and kind of go through all of the different potential questions you could see on a midterm. Yeah, no worries. And definitely if feel free to stick around if anyone else has any other questions, because I'll be here until like 3:45. So if you don't have any more questions, feel free to sign off. But if you do have more questions, feel free to ask them.
Hi, I have another question, but this time it's about SimGauge from the post lecture.
Yeah.
Quiz. Let me just pull up what number it is. Number 2, I was just confused about how to calculate the marginal product of labor, because when I was doing the video examples, I kind of made some mistakes. So I want to avoid that again.
Yeah, for sure. And you said it was the post-lecture quiz for chapter 13?
Yes, number 2.
Okay, number 2, okay. So let me open that up really quickly. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, so this question is basically asking you to determine marginal product of labor. So basically the way that I would think of determining marginal product of labor is this right here, just the change in the quantity of pizza output when an additional worker is hired. So like in this instance, it's just going to be 100 over 1 or 100. And then in the next case, so moving from 100 to 180, it's just going to be 180 minus 100 over 2 minus 1, which in this case is just 80 over 1. And so then that's basically kind of the way you move down to solve. So like for the next one, it's going to be 240 minus 180, which in this case is 60. And then it's going to be 3 over 3 minus 2, which in this case is 1. So then that's how you would get the 60 for that. Does that make sense? Or is that the part of the question 2 that you had a question on?
Yeah, so like basically, will the denominator kind of like always be 1?
Not always. So let me actually pull up an example from the lecture slides. Because yeah, it doesn't always have to be 1. It just is a lot of the time in the more simple examples. So like, let me see. where I have marginal product of labor. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, so in this example, it's basically just the change in quantity over the change in labor. So in this case, what you can see is, so like, let's say we're going to move from this point to this point. So the change in quantity is basically going to be the difference between these two. So in this case, it would be 4,000. So the difference between 10 and 4, and then the difference between 80 and 40. So then you would just take 4,000 over 40, which gives us 100. So yeah, so it doesn't always have to be over 1. It's basically just over whatever the change in labor is.
All right, got it. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's QO, yeah, change in quantity over change in labor. Exactly. Did anyone else have any other questions that they wanted to review?
Sorry, I have another question.
Yeah, no worries.
So why does average total cost decrease like if there's like an increase in production?
Very good question. So that is actually a perfect example of economies of scale. And so basically when you see average total cost decreasing as you are increasing the quantity, what that usually means is that the company has very, very low average variable costs, but very, very high average fixed costs. And so the more quantity you produce, the more amount of quantity, basically, you're able to spread the average fixed cost out. So that makes it much cheaper to produce the good. And that is why average total cost can decrease as you produce more quantity. And like in this example, you see that like average total costs start out really, really high, and then they decrease a bunch because the average fixed costs are very high. And as you produce more of the quantity, you have more quantity to take the average fixed costs. So basically, you're just dividing the total fixed costs by a larger quantity, which decreases the average total fixed costs. If that makes sense for the kind of why average fixed costs can decrease, or why average total costs can decrease.
All right, so like I'm looking at like number 26 from the practice midterm, and I'm trying to apply what you just said to the problem, and it makes sense. But like, why is it just like the by one unit like increase? Like, why is it like the rule? Like, I'm confused about that part.
Yeah, okay, let me take a look at that one. So let me share that for everyone. Okay. So 26 is asking, so Moonlight Coffee House is a firm producing 2,000 coffee drinks per day with an average total cost of $5 and a marginal cost of $2. So if it were to increase production to 2001 coffee drinks per day, which of the following must occur? And so the correct answer for 26 is C, average total cost would decrease. And so The reason for that and the reason why you know that is actually slightly different. And let me show you why that would be the case. So this is actually why. Because you are at a situation in that example where the average total cost is greater than the marginal cost. So basically what that means is that the average total cost is decreasing. And so basically you know that you are at, let me circle it. So you are at this point of the graph, or on this side of the graph, because average total costs are greater than marginal costs. And so because of that, you know that average total costs are decreasing.
All right, that's much more clear. Thank you.
Yeah. And another kind of just random, like, helpful hint for like the exam is, so something that I think is really helpful is like, if you have all of the slides, all my lecture slides, what I would honestly recommend is just combining them into one document. So then you're able to like search them during the exam. So like, for example, if you have a question that's asking about average total costs, you can basically just go in. So like, let me show you. So like hypothetically, you can just go up here and type in average total costs, and then it'll just search the document for every time that's mentioned. So that way you don't have to like scroll through and remember where everything is. If all of the lecture slides are in one document, that really enables you to be really fast when you're searching for stuff, because it is an open book exam. So like, the easier you make it on yourself to be open book is the best way forward. So I would highly suggest that if anyone wanted to kind of make searching for questions or answers on the exam a little easier, that's one good way to do it. Does anyone else have any other questions that they wanted to go over from the midterm or in preparation for the midterm? Yeah, and if no one has any other questions, feel free to leave. You definitely don't have to stick around, but I will be around for another 15 minutes if anyone does have any other questions.
Professor,
Yeah.
so the midterm is gonna be 30 questions, right? Just like,
Yeah, it'll be similar to the prior midterm, which I think was it 25 questions? Let me see. Trying to remember how many questions it was. Oh, did someone say how many questions it was? Did they remember?
Yeah, 25, Professor.
25, okay, yeah. So then it'll be exactly the same as that. 25 questions over the 75 minutes. There may be, it's going to depend on exactly how easy the questions are. It could be like 26 questions or 27, but it'll be basically around 25, depending on how easy or hard the questions are.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Do anyone else have any other questions on the midterm that they wanted to ask?
Professor,
Yeah.
I thought of asking about a final because I have another final on Sunday the 20th. And are there any news about the time specifics?
Not yet. I should be getting something within the next day or two. That's going to give me the exact time of the final. And when I do, I'll send out an email and announce that as well.
And what should we do if it overlaps?
So if it overlaps, usually we allow like students to take it a day early or at like a different time in that day if possible. It'll depend on like how many students and kind of exactly what the situation is. But yeah, if you have another exam at the same time, we can definitely work something out.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Did anyone else have any other questions about the upcoming midterm that they wanted to review? And if no one has any other questions, feel free to sign off. And if you come up with any other questions, definitely feel free to send me an email or let me know before the midterm.